Hello, my name is Caleb Warden, and I've been tasked with designing and implementing a new mechanic into this tile-based game, Tournamental. The way this mechanic functions is by allowing the player to have another interactable object, using this ball for instance. The player pushes the ball, and they have to get by these cracking tiles that when the player gets close to, they kind of shatter and cave in. If the player goes over the tiles, such as this, the player falls through and the level will then reset. So, in order to get past these tiles, the player must push this ball, and if you want to push it closer to a wall, you just have to push it a second time. The player must push the ball onto one of the cracked tiles, and the ball will fill in the cracked tile, allowing the player to pass right over. This acts as somewhat of another obstacle that the player has to bypass. Instead of just having interactables that the player has to push away now, the player has to push the interactables and push them onto these tiles to allow passage. In order to make this mechanic, I had to make a couple different blueprints. The first one I made was an interface blueprint that I called Breaking Radius. It's right here. The next one was the interactable ball, which is just a child of the interactable. And I think the final one right here is the tile, the actual tile, the worn out tile. That's just a child of the tile class. And finally, I made one function in the player pawn blueprint that helped tell when the player was within radius. We'll start by going into the worn out tile, and I'll show you the components of it. The worn out tile is made up of 4 cubes. I sized them down significantly and made it so they just filled in the 4 corners of the tile itself. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I have the base plane under there just to act as a guide towards what's low and what's high on it. Alright, looking at the event graph here, I'll start from event begin play. To start out, the tile actually sets a couple arrays for the interactables to make sure that we understand and know all the interactables in the playing field. So I just have it setting up an array for the interactable balls and the interactable boxes. And then going back to the event graph, the next thing that we have is for if the player enters a certain radius. If the player enters a neighboring tile, so that will be up, down, left, and right, no corner tiles are calculated in this. If they enter that, then we will check a boolean. It's called has entered radius. So this is asking if it hasn't entered the radius, then if it's true, then we're going to crack the tiles. So first we disable the player's input for the player pawn and controller. Then we're going to spawn a sound at the location of the tile, and that's just going to be a cracking sound. We're going to set that to a variable, so that way we can fade it out after it's finished. Then we go into a timeline that is going to be breaking the tiles. The timeline is just 1 minute or 1 second. And we have it set to 1 second just because that's how I had all the other timelines set. You'll see how it's set up when we go into the next event. Going into this is just the tile breaking lerp that kind of caves in the tiles. This is setting the entering object to fall down. If the entering object is valid, it goes through, it caves in the tiles, etc. If it's not valid, it just caves in the tiles. So if there's no entering object, in this case, if the player reaches a certain radius of the tiles and they don't actually enter it, then the entering object will not be valid and it will just cave in the tiles. In other cases, when we use this function, if the entering object is valid, let's say you push in the ball and it wants to cave in the tiles, then this will drop it down to the sphere fill Z location that we have set. And I'll pull this over so you can see it. And that's just -80 on the Z. And we have that lerping between the actor's Z location right here. And it just plugs into this input, which is just a float for the alpha that comes from the timeline. Alright, going back here. So when it finishes up, we set that has entered radius boolean so it doesn't go through this again and doesn't keep on cracking. Then we go into stopping the audio. It will just do a delayed stop and fade out for half a second, and then we re-enable the input for the player pawn. Alright, going up here to the next event. I think this is the last event that we have on the worn out tile, and we have this as the on-entered event. So when the tile is entered, we check for the entering object right here, and it goes over to set a variable that I just have set to entering object. After that's been entered, we are going to check a couple criteria to make sure and see where we need to go next in this step. So first we're going to check if a boxer player has entered. In this we go through a loop. That array of boxes that we set up earlier, we're going to be looping through each of those. So for each loop, we check to see if the entering object equals any of those boxes. And if that's true, then we set a variable, a bool that we have set up, a box has entered. If that's false, nothing happens. And after it's been completed, then we just return. So right here, we just have the return value as get player pawn, see if the player pawn equals the entering object. If the player pawn equals the entering object, then we send back a true bool. Or if the box is entered, then we send back that true bool as well. Okay, going back here. So that's just the check if box or player entered function that I've set up. Finally, we have if the ball has entered. This is another bool that we set up, and this is actually being set to false. So if the ball has not entered and a player or a box has entered, so we're making sure that just the player and the box have entered. If that's true, then we go on to this branch that says the ball has entered. So if the ball has entered, we don't want to do anything because we want to let the player walk over this space. So instead, we go to the false branch. If the ball has entered, if the ball hasn't entered, we are going to disable the player's input. I delayed for a quarter of a second just to add a bit more of delay to it, I guess. Then we go into spawning a sound at just 2D, since this is more of a top-down, almost 2D isometric game. Then we go to set this sound variable, and we do a timeline right here. The timeline goes into whether or not the boxer player will fall, and then it has the tiles fall along with it. This is just lerping the entering object we have this variable set up right here. It's just a flow, goes to I have it set to -200. I've noticed that negative even 120, 100 will do about the same trick. -200 just gives it a little bit more speed dropping. So we have that lerping on the Z. Close some of these out real quick. And then tiles fall is looks a little bit long here, but in actuality it's just the same thing for each of these cubes. Coming in, you will just use the first cube, second cube, third cube. You have to go through, the way I did it is I went to the viewport, clicked on each of the cubes here to see which one was in what location, and then I would switch to the rotation, and I would rotate it to see how much I needed to rotate, and which ones were going to be rotating positive and which ones were going to be rotating negative, if that makes sense. We wanted it to go inward, to cave inward, to create this divot effect almost, like it's caved in and it can collapse at any moment. So after I figured out which ones needed to have a negative rotation and positive rotation on which axis, we just put an input pin to the lerp, and we lerped those axes with the according rotations here. We set up a positive fall rotation and a negative fall rotation, and then we have this as the tile fall Z location. Again, that's like having the player fall through. It's just going to lower it down a bunch. So we have actually two different rotations. This is a fall rotation, and we have also a, let me see if I can find it here, positive cave-in rotation. The cave-in rotation we have set to 20 and negative 20 for the negative cave rotation. For the fall rotation, I just added 180 onto that to make it have like a falling, the tiles spin a little bit, to give it that, I guess, actual falling feel, not just so that they don't just drop down. So you can see that's set to positive fall rotation, set to 200, negatives to negative 200 to give it that proper rotation. Good falling effect. And then after you've figured out which ones have the which rotations, you just go on through and do it for each of them. Okay. And that's the timeline for that. After it's done, we're going to stop and fade out the audio again, and then we get the player pawn. We see if the entering object was the player pawn, then we're going to reset the level. Because if the player pawn enters this tile before a ball has, you see, because we already checked if the ball entered. If it enters and the ball hasn't, we just want the player to fall through and the level to reset. So if the player pawn entered and it's gotten to this point, then we're just going to reset the level. If it was a box, though, we wouldn't want the level to reset. We just want that box to be absorbed and taken out of the level. So then we go to, backtracking here. Going back to this bowl that we had set up, then we're going to go to false. So, right here we're just checking if the ball has entered. This is just going through entering objects, seeing if they're equal to the interactable ball, and checking if the ball has already entered. This just makes sure that you can't set more than one ball in the same tile. This branches out, and if it's true, which means that the ball hasn't entered, and one of the interactable balls in this array equals this entering object, then, if it's true, we're going to disable the player's input and spawn the sound at location. Honestly, you can spawn 2D sounds. 2D sounds in this, again, I don't think would make too much of a difference since it's top-down. It doesn't rely on the camera being attached to the actual player. So we're going to set that audio right there. I have my sound going starting at 1 second, but that's just because my sound has a bit of like a delay to start out. So after we set that, we're going to go to the timeline. We're going to play from start, and it's going to update two things. We have this cave-in tiles, which is much like the fall tile fall. This function that we just looked at. We're going to get each cube. We're going to figure out in the viewport which ones need negative rotations, which one needs positive rotations, and we're just going to lerp those. We're just going to plug them in and have them lerping between. Oh, yeah. So it was the y-axis. It was x and y-axis. The z-axis is the one that would just rotate it to the side. So we're going to rotate or lerp between the x and the y, the roll and the pitch. My cube one needed negative. This one needed positive. You can see we just have them set up to the negative 20 and 20, and instead of having it negative 200 and 200, this one's just going to cave it in slightly instead of having them almost inverted. So we do that for each cube. Have them do that cave-in effect. And then at the same time, we're going to have the ball drop, which just takes the entering object, gets its location, and lerps the z with this other flow variable that we have set up to. I have it set up to negative 80. I've noticed that I think negative 100 on this is about a sweet spot. If you go below it, it might be a little bit too much. If you go above it, you can be maybe a little too high. It might cut off the player's legs a little bit. So just mess around with that. And then we just have it setting the actor's location. Again, like the rest of these lerps that I have set up here. After it's finished, we're going to set the ball as entered, since the ball just finished dropping into the spot and filling it. So we disable the collision on it just so that the player can't collide with it. Then we go into setting the tile as can enter so that the player can walk into the tile. And then we set the ball. So we set the variable ball has entered. So now all of those will come back as pretty much false when it's checking if the ball has not entered yet. And then we are going to enable the player's input. So going in right here, we delay and fade out the cracking rocks sound effects that we set back right before the timeline. And then we're going to set has entered radius to make sure that the tiles don't cave in again if they go through this loop right here, or this event right here. Okay. So that is actually it for the worn out tile blueprint. Just double check. Yeah, so I'll go through and make sure that all of these, we went through that. Reset level is just something that I actually used from, I forget which one it was. It was one of the blueprints in here, but I just used kind of how they had it set up to get the current level's name, then reopen that level, and we're going to enable the player's input. Just because whenever we needed to reset it, we had already had the player's input disabled from right here. We disabled the player's input and then needed it re-enabled. Okay, going back here. Now we're going to take a look at the interactable ball. Okay, so to start out, we're going to initialize an array of the worn out tiles. We're just going to get all actors of class, worn out tile, and set it to a variable there. Next, we have a couple, let's see here, actually just one event set up. And that only event is the interact event. So when the player interacts with it, we're going to get the parent interact. We're going to set this variable player. We're going to get that player's current tile and set that to the old tile. And then we're going to get our current tile, so the interactable's current tile that it's on, and set that to the target tile. We just have this, the variable set up to make it a little bit easier to set up functions instead of having to put all of this in there. Just have it set up to that type of stuff. This goes through a branch right here to see if the player has stamina. We use this from, I believe it is one of the interactables. I think it's the box interactable uses it. Yeah, the box interactable uses this down here to check if stamina was sufficient, and we just use that again. If it's true, if the player has enough stamina, then we set those variables and we initialize the push direction. Initializing the push direction just gets the target tile, which is the interactable's tile that it's on, and then the old tile, which is the tile that the player's on. We go from the neighbor direction, we get that, and we get the opposite direction of that. We check to see if push direction is valid. If it's true, then we're going to we're going to see if the push direction is valid, and then if it is valid, we're going to go to this branch, and this branch just checks if the push direction equals the neighbor direction's opposite direction, which would make it essentially the second time it's pushed in that direction, if that makes sense. So if it's the second time it's being pushed in that direction and the push direction is already valid, then we're going to set this variable, this bool, push second time to true. If it's false, if it's been pushed, let's say up, and then you're pushing it to the right, then it will just go to the false branch and it'll just say set push second time to false. If this is not valid, it's just going to say set push second time to false. And then after that, through both of them, we're going to set the push direction. Okay, going back to the event graph. And then we're going to go into a while loop. The conditional for the while loop is we're going to find our target tile's neighbors, and we're going to use our push direction that we just initialized there. We're going to see, can you enter this tile? Is the tile valid? And has a worn out tile been hit? Or has a worn out tile not been hit? So if it's been hit, then this will stop. And the loop body, we have a function set up called find target tile. In this, we increment the number of spaces. So we have a integer right here set up called number of spaces, and each time it goes through the loop, it will increment this, and we'll show you where that comes in here in a second. We're going to use the isTileNeighbor function again and get the target tile, old tile, just exactly the same thing that we did when we were initializing the push direction here. We're just going to get the opposite direction of that neighboring tile. We're going to get our neighbors. We're going to use that to find if the target can be entered. We're going to see is the tile is neighbor, and we're going to make sure that this is valid. If those are all true, it goes down to here, and it says target tile equals, or set the target tile to the old tile, and then we're going to set for target tile, it will be the target tile that we just got, or the neighbor that we just got from the target tile, if that makes sense. So this is saying it's kind of moving forward, if that makes sense. The target tile becomes the old tile, and then the neighbor tile of the target becomes the new target. And then we set the push direction afterwards. Okay. So this branch is going to be called after we do this for each loop. This for each loop is just going to check and make sure that the worn out tile hasn't been hit. So we go through this worn out tiles array that we set up at the event start, at the begin play right in here. And then we're going to check each array element, make sure that it's not, we're going to see if each array element is equal to the target tile, the tile that we want. We're going to see if it's equal to one of these worn out tiles. If that's true, then we're going to set the target tile to worn out tile. And then we're going to set worn out tile hit to true. And then after that's complete, then we go into that branch that we just talked about, set up all the other stuff. If it's false, if this is false, then we go to not setting these to anything, any of these. Okay. Alrighty. So after that loop, that long while loop there has been set up, we go down to one more branch here, and we see, was the worn out tile hit? If it has been hit, then we're going to set this to moving. We're going to set the play rate and stamina. So this is another function we set up. We use the same stamina setup that they used in the interactable box here. I think it's, yeah, right here at the end. I take the stamina before the timeline just because I feel like it adds more feedback earlier, instead of, since this ball rolls for an indeterminate length, it might be easier if it's being pushed a far length to see, okay, I actually used some stamina, the game's not glitching out. And then right here we have set timeline play rate. We're just setting the play rate of whatever timeline we select. This is useful because we can use it between the various branches that we have set up for various timelines. We have the number of spaces, and that's going to be divided by however much you want to slow it down. If you want it to be faster, divide it by 0.5. It'll make it a little bit faster. If you want it to be a little bit slower, I have mine to 2, just so the play rate is a little bit on the smoother, slower side instead of being overly fast. I found that if you have it at 0.5, it might just zip across the tiles and really not give the player that satisfying push that you want. All right. So we use that. We plug in the component here, that timeline that we have set up for right here. We're going to disable the player's input and then use this on exit event that we had from the tile blueprint. We're going to plug in our target tile, which is the current tile, or the target is the current tile. Our target tile is target tile, and then the exiting object is self. That's the on exit event. Okay, going into the timeline here, this is just moving to the worn out tile. So back here again, it equaled the worn out tile. We're going to move to the worn out tile. We're going to set the first one to our current tile. So it's going to move from the tile that the ball's on right now all the way to the worn out tile. We just have that lerping between location, setting actor location, and in this timeline we just have it set to length of 1, have it a basic. I have it set to an auto interpolation to make it have a nice slow in, slow out curve, a nice Bezier curve. And we have the alpha going in there. After this is finished up, we are going to set the number of spaces back to 0, because we want to make sure that when we have the set play rate here, we don't keep on adding on space after space after space. We just want it to say, okay, it's 6 spaces long. Let's maybe make that a little bit of a, longer play rate, rather than having the same play rate between 6 spaces and 1 space. right here, we're just going to be setting moving to false, making it know that the ball has stopped, it's done, it's at the final destination. We're going to set the current tile to worn out tile. We're going to do the on entered event. The target tile will be the worn out tile because we just entered that. Previous tile will have as current tile because that's what we moved from. And we're going to have entering object as self because we just want to say the ball entered this. Enable the input again, and then we go down to this branch. That's the true if the worn out tile was hit. If the worn out tile wasn't hit, we go down to check. Okay, does the current tile equal the target tile? Is the ball actually being pushed? Is pretty much what we're asking. If that's true, we do nothing. We don't want the player to waste any stamina. If the ball isn't moving in any direction, we're not going to take any stamina. We're not going to do anything with the ball. If it was pushed a second time, is going to be called right here. We're going to see if the ball was pushed a second time. If that's true, we're going to... Here, we'll actually go to the false because it might be a little more clear. In most cases, this won't come first. So it'll go through the false branch first. So if it hasn't been pushed a second time, if you're pushing it for the first time, it goes down here. We're going to set the play rate and stamina just as we did above. We're going to plug in the timeline component that we have for this one, which is ball is moving to open tile. We have that plugged in right there. We're going to spawn sound 2D. Again, this sound I have starting at 1 second just because it has that little delay at the beginning. We're going to set a variable right there for the sound. We're going to disable the player's input. Going into this, I had issues setting up the on exit event that we had previously used right here from the tile class. So I went into that and dragged out pretty much the necessary items that I needed, which is setting we set the ball to is moving, and then we're going to set the current tile. We're going to set the object in it to none, and make sure that the players can enter it, that players and objects can enter it again. And then after that's done, we're going to play this from the start. This is another timeline for the ball being moved. So to update this, we're just lerping from the current tile to the old tile. So a problem that I ran into with having the target tile as the tile's location that we're going to is usually that target tile that we would get would be right by a wall. And oftentimes you would push the ball and it would go into this wall, and then what other direction do you have to push it until it's in another wall? So it sends it into a corner. The player really can't do anything with it. They can't pull it. So I wanted to give the player a couple opportunities. The player can push it once in one direction and it'll stop right about one space before that wall. So this old tile is set to that space right before. It's the previous tile of that wall tile that we're trying to avoid. And it goes from the current tile to that old tile. So it stops one away. After we finish that, we're going to do the on-enter event. Again, I had issues using the on-enter and on-exit event for these ones. So I have this set up to cast to self, get the interactable ball, set that to this old tiles. We're going to have this set to the old tiles, current interactable. That's what this will do right here. And then we're going to make sure that the old tile has its can enter set to false, so objects can't enter it. And then we're going to set right here current object type to interactable for the old tile. Just doing what the on enter event does. And then again, we're going to set number of spaces to 0, delay and fade out that the sound effects that we have. Oops. We're going to set our current tile to the old tile that we just moved to. Set is moving to false, and re-enable the player pawn's movement so that the player pawn can't multiply push the ball over and over again. Okay. So, going back up to this branch we have set up here, if the player does push it a second time now. So, let me see if I can... viewport. Okay. So, the way we have it set up is it'll push it one away, and if the player pushes it one more time, then it just actually goes to the target tile, is how we have it set up. So if it's true, we do the same thing. We set the play rate and stamina. We spawn the sound, set that to a variable, disable the input, do the on-exit event that we had set up. We're going to do the on-exit event as the old tile because it's still going to be, it'll be the same thing. You can set it up as current tile too. Old tile, current tile in this instance are one and the same. You're going to go to this timeline right here and have it lerping from target tile to current tile. The current tile will be the tile that you're already on. The target tile is the tile that we didn't want to go to first, right by the wall. It gives the player that opportunity if they want to push the ball back, if they accidentally pushed it close to the wall, or if they want to, push it certain directions. Gives them more control over it. When that's finished, we're going to do the on entered event again. I had trouble with it, so I just had it set up my own way. So I have it casting to self right here. I have it setting the target tiles, current interactable, to the ball. I have it setting the target tile to can't enter, and the object type to interactable. Then we go up to here where we have the number of spaces resetting, the sound effect fading out and delaying the stop, setting up the target tile, setting up the target tile as our current tile, making sure that the ball is set to not moving, and re-enabling that player's input. Alright. That is just about it for, I believe that's all of the functions and stuff for the interactable ball. Moving on to the interface. The only interface that we made was the breaking radius, and this just says the radius was entered radius. That's all it's being used for. We have the player pawn interacting with the tile in this case. Okay. So we made this function called check for worn out tile. So whenever the player moves up, down, left, right, any which way, we're going to move the player, do the player movement stuff, and then check to make sure that no worn out tile was hit. This function looks a little bit like this. We initialize up here in the event begin play. We initialize this array of worn out tiles. There we go. Initialize the worn out tiles. So we're going to go through a for each loop for each of these elements in this. We're going to check to see, does it equal our current tile's neighbor to the down, left, right, or up? If it equals one of those, so we have it set to if the item is there. So if the item isn't false, if there's a spot there and it equals the down neighbor, or if it equals the left or right or up, etc., going on. So if that's true, then we go to the entered radius, which is this function right here in the interface. And that communicates, in the target of that we have set to the array element. So if it equals that array element, and then we send this entered radius message to go back to the tiles, to the tile where it will trigger this event to enter the radius, and we already went through that where it cracks the tile, bends it down, and caves it in. Alright. That is the last for the player character, I believe. Let me just double check here. Yep. So it enters that, sends that message, and we just have it doing that for each of the movements. So that way we can check each time, depending on if there's multiple tiles. I was thinking in instances such as my level here that I have set up, if you have multiple of these tiles, I want to make sure that the player is constantly checking that these tiles, checking to see if a tile is within its radius, and if so, crack it, so that way we can set that boolean that's in the tile blueprint to true, so it doesn't crack multiple times. So other than that, I believe that is the final bit to this mechanic. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to look in my comments on my tile on Trello. Thank you.